Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Good to see you again, John.
It's nice. We're right around Memorial Day now, so things are really taking off.
We are in the thick of planting season.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of planting, before we get too far, I want to say we'd like to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 off of Exit 6, just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead. Hey, Don, what do plants eat in the afternoon?
Let me think. What would plants eat in the afternoon? I don't know.
A light snack.
I love it.
You get it?
Yes, and I got it, and especially you put emphasis on the light.
It's all in the telling. It's all in the touch, having the good touch there. But I wanted to use that joke because we're going to talk about planting, not just plants, but planting in pots. And we're going to be talking about planting in planters, pots, and hanging baskets, and what to look for in those things, what to look for in what kind of pots or what kind of plants you want to pot, what to look for in pots and baskets and planters, and also even what to look for in potting soil.
Yeah, and all of these can kind of be grouped under the heading container gardening. Gardening in containers. And man, has this been popular. Because just think, decks, patios, porches, and all of that are just custom made for containers.
So when you had your garden center, how long ago was that? That was
from about 1984 and about the 25 years following that, so into the early 2000s.
So
2010 or so.
How much have you seen container gardening grow since then?
It is just totally ballooned. Just think of all the time we're spending outdoors on, patios, decks have really improved. They just aren't a little deck like they used to be. Now it's, we have a much nicer outdoor living area. Living areas outdoors, outdoor living rooms have been kind of a thing now. And of course, porches are popular again. Yeah. So now we can put things out on the porch. So the outdoor living that we do now, just think barbecuing outside, eating outside, out your back door or whatever. And there's a lot of people that have front sitting areas. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
A lot of people are moving, so they can kind of enjoy the neighborhood. And of course, container gardening goes right along with that because, you can decorate those places, kind of make them beautiful by the use of containers.
Yeah. So why use containers instead of just planting things in the ground? Like what do you think? Obviously, because it offers a little bit of versatility, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It is really much easier to create a beautiful flower garden in containers. Now, here's why. Okay, for example, around a patio or a deck, if you put an in-ground flower bed around that, that's nice. That'll sometimes work. But by using containers of flowers, you can situate them like on the deck or on the patio, kind of move them around, create little areas. And so the placement is so much easier than trying to do an in-ground that surrounds it. So the placement is so much easier. You can develop some height, larger, taller containers, do a grouping of, a couple of tall, some short ones. You can kind of create a dynamic with the containers. And you control the soil that's going to go in. We can talk about potting soil. But rather than dealing with the existing in-ground soil, you can customize the soil in a container so plants will grow even better. And then the fertilizing and all the different things. It's much easier to manage. Even the watering is probably easier in a container than trying to water an in-ground, in some ways. So you have a much more probably manageable flower garden by doing it in containers. I still love in-ground planters, in-ground flower beds, obviously.
Yeah.
But like even on a porch, you can decorate a porch with flowering containers more so than you would probably an in-ground.
Yeah, and I like that idea of the flexibility. I hadn't really thought about that because you can try something over on this side, or you can try a grouping of 3 here. Kind of if you plant it in the ground, you've dug the hole, you've put them in.
It's there for the season.
You're less inclined to dig up a plant and move them. We do that from time to time, but if you just have planters, you can kind of arrange them to say, like, if you've got a tall one that you want in back, or if a tall one you want on one side, and you can kind of play with that to figure out the look that you like.
Yeah, so it's no wonder that it's so popular.
And then the other thing, of course, too, is that not everybody has a yard. People who live in apartments or condominiums or things like that who don't have. Oh
gosh, yes, balconies, patios, balconies. The porches off of a condo, an area, balconies.
Railing baskets, I see a lot more of those too.
And so can you imagine some of these big apartment complexes if everybody on their balcony planted something?
That'd be nice.
Wouldn't that be quite a look?
It would be, it would give you something nice to look at other than brick.
Yeah, can you imagine driving down the street on some of these big apartment complexes? Wouldn't it be something to see each of those balconies have planted?
Well, and that's the thing. You drive around at Christmas and you look up, and sometimes, the ones that are like condominiums where there's a condominium association, they'll get everybody on board with a decoration, right?
We need to start a movement.
Lights. Yeah, I think so. You should have a condominium plant association.
Exactly, a movement.
So what kind of plants do you want to use in planters and baskets and other containers? Because I would think that there's obviously you can't put a shrub in there. Maybe you can. But like, what kinds of things would you be looking for? What are the things to look for?
Well, now that brings up a good point. And a commonly asked question is, can I plant some perennial flowers in containers? Because then I wouldn't have to plant them each year. They'd come up each year. But the answer is generally no. Because perennial flowers, no matter how winter hardy they are in the ground, if we plant those in planters above the ground, the cold is too intense for just coming in from the outside. So they usually will not winter. So what we're looking at for containers is annual type flowers, the type of things that we enjoy for one season, and then frost kills them. And plant breeders have been so amazing over the last decade or two. They've developed all these neat types of plants that are well adapted for containers. Now, one good example, one of the earliest, was the wave petunias. The old-fashioned petunias for flower beds are beautiful in flower beds, but if you put them in a container or even a hanging basket, tend to get a little rangy maybe. But the wave petunias, the original purple wave, of course, spreads really, really far, but they've developed in wave petunias tailored to hanging baskets and containers. They develop a beautiful full look, they bloom all summer, and they stay kind of compact enough to be in a container. And so there are dozens of these container-friendly new plants. The garden centers are full of them. Usually they're sold in maybe about a 4-inch pot or 3-inch pot. And so they have a good root system all ready to go into these containers. So an amazing assortment of new plants. And it's fun to see. When my wife Mary and I first started the garden center in 1984, there were not all of these container-friendly plants available. So we're in good times gardening.
I want to jump back to one thing that you were talking about perennials, that perennials in the pot would not survive the winter. I know some people, though, will take perennials and they'll plant them in the ground after a period in the summer. Do you recommend that? And if so, is there a time that you want to get them in the ground by?
Yeah, usually if you do want to get a perennial in the ground, it's best done so at least by the middle of the growing season. Okay. In the heat of July, maybe isn't the best for planting season, but it does need at least that amount of weeks to establish well before going into winter.
All right. There's a common phrase that's used in container gardening, and can you talk a little bit about what is a thriller, what is a filler, and what is a spiller?
Yes, and you see those phrases if you ever look online. How to develop or design a good container planting, or even a hang basket container. How do you know what to put in? So you'll see those 3 terms: a filler, a spiller, and a thriller. So let's talk about that. So if you want to make a really well-designed container, so let's take a look at each of those 3. Okay, first of all, a thriller. A thriller would be a type of a plant that maybe is a little bit upright, maybe an upright oval. It's going to be the thing that you notice first when you look at it, something really showy. That's going to catch your eye, okay? Maybe it's a bright daisy type flower. And daisies can be annual type daisies. It can be red, pink, yellow, white, something that's really going to catch your eye. There's many, many types of things that can be used for that thriller, but an eye catcher. So then the next is the spiller. A spiller is going to be a vining type material that when planted kind of on the outer perimeter is going to go over, it'll spill over the edges of the container. So that'll kind of soften the edges of the container, so you'll have something kind of draping over. So we've got the thriller, kind of the eye catcher. We've got the spiller. Then the third would be a filler, something kind of in between that'll just kind of fill the spaces, not necessarily drape over, and it won't be maybe the bigger, taller feature, but it will be something that fills in the gaps. So there you have the thriller, the spiller, and the filler. Now, I should mention, when you're designing a container like that, that's kind of a good thing to shoot for, but also for hanging baskets or even a large pot, there's nothing wrong with putting one type of plant in. For example, some of the petunias, the wave-type petunias, and when I say wave-type, there's a big assortment of those.
Does that include like supertunias?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The supertunias.
Vistas?
Beautiful. Yeah, the Vista bubblegum.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And so those in their own right, just planted singly in a container, when I say singly, just that type of plant. Maybe you'll put multiples of that, but just let that be the feature in that entire container. That can be just beautiful. Last year, my wife and I planted one called Bee's Knees, a yellow one of those supertunias. And it's just awesome all by itself. So you can do the combo, or you can just plant it in one of these big, massive pots all by itself.
And then especially in a basket, you probably you want to situate, or figure out where your situation is, because if you want a thriller, maybe you won't have the height to put in something really tall there if you're hanging it from, if it's
right.
So you want to kind of know that area. But something like a lot of these petunias too, some of the newer ones will actually mound a little bit, won't they?
Yeah, they do.
So they will get a little bit of height,
do
and
the
they will fill over
combination.
the side.
They kind of make their own thriller, spiller, and filler all in one.
Yeah.
They'll kind of round themselves out over the edges, but they'll also have some height. And of course, when I mentioned the thriller being maybe a little higher, it has to be in relation to the size of the pot. It can't be tall. So we're looking at that. Oh, another thing I should mention too, when you're selecting the plants, for example, the thriller, the spiller, and the filler, if you're choosing it for a sunny container, they all need to be sun-loving. For example, you wouldn't want to put a sun-loving petunia along with a shade-loving impatiens. But if it's a shady type container, then you'd go with your begonias, the impatiens, coleus, so that all of those items like the shade. Otherwise, if you mix sun-loving, shade-loving, one or the other is going to take over.
How about another thing to consider? I would imagine watering needs, because you wouldn't want to put in something that has to dry out completely next to something that wants to stay a little moist.
Yeah, absolutely true. Because, if you combine, for example, moss roses that like it hot and dry, if you combine that with lobelia that like it kind of cool, moist, one or the other of those is probably going to win out. Hey, I got to talk a little bit about geraniums in containers. Geraniums are really popular because there's so many colors. Geraniums do beautifully in containers. One thing, try planting a container of just geraniums. And here's why. Geraniums, which do beautifully, tend to be overtaken by some of the other plant material in a container if you do a combination. For example, sweet potato vine, which is a nice spiller, spills over the edge.
Great colors.
Yeah. Snowstorm, which is a great spiller. But if you combine a filler and a spiller with a geranium, sometimes they are going to overtake the geranium, and by the end of the season, geranium isn't going to be as visible. Geraniums kind of don't like the competition of others in a container. So if ever you've noticed that your geranium by the end of the season just isn't the feature anymore, try planting a pot of just all geraniums.
And I know
that's an amazing look.
I know that I think my mom has kept a geranium for a number of years. You bring it inside in the winter, and she's potted it and repotted it for the winter.
Yeah, we got to do a whole podcast on how to winter geraniums.
Yeah,
towards probably late August, early September.
What about fertilizing? Because we fertilize we have a garden plot, or we have a garden bed or flower bed, we would fertilize that when needed. What about how much do we need to fertilize our container?
Well, those containers are totally dependent on us, aren't they? They're totally dependent on us for the water that we give, unless you get rain. But generally, they're going to depend on us for watering. But they also depend on us for the nutrition because it's in a closed-in container. So a couple of things on the nutrition, the fertility, is if you start with a high-quality potting mix, and we'll talk about potting mixes, but a lot of the high-quality potting mixes say on the label, feeds plants for 3 months or 6 months. So they have the little beads of fertilizer in, which is a slow-release fertilizer that's going to add some nutrition to it. So that's a good starting point. Start out with a high-quality potting mix. But the other thing, too, is you can supplement the containers with a water-soluble type. And, of course, we don't endorse particular brands, but the most common is like the Miracle Grow water-soluble types. And plants in containers are heavy feeders. I like that term, heavy feeders, meaning they do well with nutrition. So since that root system is confined into a container like that, if we give them the extra nutrition, so even if your potting mix has fertility in it, supplementing that with water-soluble fertilizer, maybe every 2 weeks or so, in place of one of the waterings, water it in with the water-soluble fertilizer. That is a great thing. The other thing that a person can do too, we're going to talk about reusing potting mix. Now, so if you reuse potting mix that started out as high quality, after a season, that fertilizer that it once had is gone. That's going to be all used up. So we can reuse potting mix, but we need to add more fertilizer. A good way to do that is with a product called Osmocote. Osmocote, which are little beads. It's those little beads of fertilizer that slowly release the nutrition into the soil. So if you're reusing potting mix or it didn't have fertilizer to begin with, then these beads of Osmocote will slowly release. And the package will tell you how much to add for a certain diameter of pot. So that will kind of recharge the soil again. And when you read the label on the Osmocote slow release, it will say that it's fine to supplement with water-soluble fertilizer every couple of weeks or so. So if we think of it as these container plants are heavy feeders, they respond very well to extra nutrition, and also that they're very dependent on us because their root system is enclosed. And so watching the fertilizer, it's not just something nice. It's not just a nice extra. It's really something that can make those containers shine.
All right, we're going to take a short little break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking some dirt. We're going to be talking potting soil. So we'll be back in a minute.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Okay, so we're talking container gardening today, and we're going to talk about some potting soil. So Don, walk us through what should we be looking for in potting soil, because there you go into a store and there can be a bunch. And actually, let's start with this. Do I need potting soil, or can I just dig up dirt from my yard?
Hey, that's a great spot to start because, yes, in containers, we absolutely need potting mix. And here's why. the best field soil, the most fertile field soil that can grow wonderful grains, or the best vegetable garden soil that can grow great vegetables, or flower garden soil, once that gets in a raised pot or container, it just packs. It always just packs. And, well, could we add peat moss, perlite, different things? Well, by the time you buy those ingredients and amend soil like that, you may as well just buy potting mix. So using field soil, vegetable garden soil is really not recommended just because it packs so greatly. And then the plant roots can't get the air that they need. And so that's why potting mix was developed. And that's what I use exclusively, just potting mix. So potting mix is an interesting term. Now, you can buy bags that will say garden soil, but that's a heavier material not meant for pots. That's meant for gardens. So potting mix is the key. And what makes a potting mix is oftentimes it has a lot of peat moss or nicely balanced compost. It also has drainage materials such as perlite or vermiculite. Perlite are little white beads. Vermiculite are little kind of golden flecks. And it has a good balance of organic material plus good drainage material. And so this isn't really the spot to scrimp. Buy the good stuff, a good potting mix. Okay, and again, we don't endorse brands, but the most commonly available that you see is Miracle-Gro potting mix.
And we're talking, it's a readily available.
Readily available. You can buy it almost anywhere.
Yeah.
And that's the one that I use all the time.
Hardware stores to garden centers to probably even your big box retailers like Target.
Yeah, all have it in various size bags. Also, the second place to get a very good, high-quality potting mix would be locally owned garden centers. They will oftentimes have a mix similar to what they use in their own greenhouse production for growing all their bedding plants and hanging baskets, etc. So ask the locally owned garden centers, and they may have their own brand that they equally recommend, and those are super. Here's what to avoid. Avoid the cheap bargain brands at the national chains, because you really get what you pay for. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about how you can keep using a high-quality potting mix. Okay, one way that I tell the good quality potting mix from a cheap, not-so-good potting mix is by the weight of the bag. I've noticed some of the cheap, inexpensive ones, the bags are just heavy. You're paying for like moisture. Some of it is just like composted bark without a whole lot of other good nutrition, and they're just heavy, and they don't work as well. And so you do get what you pay for, and I want my containers. Our growing season is precious.
Yeah.
I want my containers to do well. That's why I start with a high-quality mix, and I'm as thrifty as anybody. But now, so start with a good high-quality mix. And your next question is maybe going to be, can we reuse that potting mix from year to year? Okay, so you start with good high-quality mix. Your plants are doing really well. Well, do I have to dump that for next year, or can I reuse? And the answer is yes, you can definitely reuse it from year to year. My wife Mary and I have used the same potting mix probably 5, 6, 7 years at least. But a couple of things to remember. Okay, at the end of a growing season, remove all the roots and the old plant pieces. Okay, so it's ready to go for the next spring. Then the next spring, maybe take out maybe a fourth and add about a fourth of new mix, just to kind of mix it in, blend it up so it's got a little bit of fresh stuff. And then make sure that you keep the fertility up on it, because the fertilizer that it once had was going to be used up. And so you can definitely reuse these high-quality potting mixes. We've had wonderful luck.
Now, we talked about some of the things to look for on a bag. You said like vermiculite, and what was the other one? The
perlite, the little white beads.
Yep. What about something like, I've seen this on bags, what does moisture control mean?
Yes, moisture control. Some of the name brands of potting mix often have their standard mix. Then they'll have one called moisture control mix. And those are mixes that are specially blended to retain moisture better. For example, in hanging baskets, which tend to dry out fairly often.
Because they're
frequently.
exposed.
They're exposed, yep. Not always the hugest containers, so they can dry out. And so moisture control mix is oftentimes used for hang baskets, whether you're creating your own. And oftentimes the garden centers, when they're planting those hang baskets, if you buy one ready-made, they'll have that moisture control. Now, they used to use kind of a gel-type product in those that would hold moisture. But now they've gone to a product. Most of these, if you look at the ingredients, they have the product called Coconut Coir, C-O-I-R. And that's a material that it's a nice organic material, but it tends to hold the moisture a little bit longer. So if you've ever had problems with your containers, either a hang basket or another container, kind of drying out a little quicker than you'd like, try the moisture control mixes.
You've talked in the past, you said that we should be wetting down potting soil before we put it in a pot. Why is that necessary? Because we're going to water it anyway, right?
Yes, because these high-quality potting mixes are usually sold quite dry, so you aren't paying for a lot of water and just so you can pick up these big pigs. And so they're sold quite dry. And most of them are peat moss, sometimes compost, and it takes a little bit for them to re-wet when they're that dry. So if you use the mix fresh out of the bag when you're doing up a container, fresh out of the bag where they're dry, and you pot up your stuff, then you go to water, and the mix just kind of floats around. But if you, the day before, water the mix down good, I either dump it in a wheelbarrow and water it down good, or just open the bag and with the garden hose or a watering can, add water. How much water? You kind of have to go by feel little. But I then mix it around good with my hands, and the next day it is the nicest, most mellow, non-dusty material that you've ever seen, and so much easier to work with. After planting, you still need to water it good, but that's a really important step. Hey, one other thing before I forget, John. A common question is, with some of these big, tall containers, do we need to fill them all the way up? Some of them are, 3 feet or so. It takes a lot of potting mix for us. So a common question is, do we have to fill that whole thing with potting mix, or can we put something in the bottom?
Because really the roots may not get all the way down, right?
Yeah, exactly. They usually will not. Most of the container plants that we put in these need around 18 inches or so of soil. Might be able to get by with 12, but I'd be more happy with about 18 inches. So if you have a 3-foot container, you only maybe need half or so of that filled with the potting mix. So what to put in the lower half? Well, people have been really creative. Some people use the styrofoam packing peanuts or pop cans, milk jugs, plastic milk jugs, almost anything to take up some space.
Now, does that work better? Because we used to do, or it used to be, rocks. People would put rocks in the bottom of planting containers, and you say that that's not really a good idea anymore.
That can help keep it from tipping over if you ever have problems. Now, you bring up an interesting point. On indoor houseplant containers, it's not recommended anymore to put rocks in the bottom because there's a drainage type thing that it actually kind of impedes, and it can cause the houseplant soil to be too saturated, actually. And it's kind of counterintuitive. But anyway, outdoors in our containers, overwatering usually isn't the problem. And so even though a layer of rocks in the bottom isn't overly recommended, it's not going to cause the soil soggy problem that it would on a houseplant, if you follow me. Because usually outdoors with the air, things are going to dry off fine. So you don't really need to put a drainage layer in the bottom. I skip it. I don't put drainage layer in the bottom of any of ours unless I have a big, huge container that I'm trying to take up some soil space, and then I'll put just some objects in, such as pop cans. Some of the newer big containers have false bottoms.
Oh, yeah.
They'll even be sold so that they just have that kind of false. They look like a 3 or 4 foot big thing. They have the height, but they actually have a false bottom in, and it's important that false bottom has drainage in. I should mention that too. Whatever container you're going to use outdoors, make sure it has drainage holes in.
Yeah.
Too.
What about we talked about being able to save potting soil. How do we store that over the winter, especially up here where it can get, so cold and things could dry out? Do you put it in a bag? Do you put it in a tote? Do you just put it, like you said, in your wheelbarrow?
If it's a plastic type pot that's not breakable, we just leave ours just outside.
Okay.
And we kind of tuck them up by the porch a little bit just so that they're out of the way. But even the cold can help kill any insects that might have been in there, or maybe any diseases. Maybe can't winter in a pot like that above ground level. And so we just leave ours like that, clean them up good first. But if it's a ceramic or a breakable type pot, then it's important not to let that freeze wet, because the expansion of it freezing could easily crack that. So though a person might wish to put a cover over the top, let them dry out really good, put a cover over the top so that they don't get wet in some of the fall rains, or move them into the garage, something like that.
We're going to take another break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about the pots, the planters, and the baskets. What's best for different kinds of plants? What's best for your space?
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
So we're back this week. We're talking about container gardens, and right now we're going to talk about the containers themselves. So what do you look for in a pot or a planter or a hanging basket? What do you look for in a container?
Well, the number one thing, of course, is drainage. It's got to have drainage holes in the bottom so the water doesn't pond up and drown the plants. But it's interesting. Almost anything can be used for a container. An old wheelbarrow with holes punched in the middle. An old wagon. Those make kind of neat things. You got to make sure you have enough soil depth somehow in it. Maybe put pots inside the wagon or something. Old boots I've seen used. An old desk repurposed. The drawers open and then plants put in the drawers.
Your neighbors may not appreciate it as we're learning if you use an old toilet, though. That's creating quite a kerfuffle.
I've seen
here.
that.
Yeah.
Old bathtubs used to be sunk down in and planted in. Tractor tires. Large old tractor tires. And luckily, I think creativity has taken over, and some of those things we don't see as much.
What about I've even seen actual old wicker baskets. I suppose if you put a liner in
so it wouldn't rot so much.
Yeah.
But really, almost anything can be used. And of course, the garden centers have such a nice display of pots. As long as we're talking about the types of containers, a good look is to, once you decide what style of container you like, oftentimes they sell them in different sizes, different heights, of that same container style. And what makes kind of almost a flower bed look is to choose 3 containers of varying size. One a little taller, one medium, one smaller. And then on your deck or porch, you can kind of put those 3 together, and it's like a ready-made, like a flower garden. Rather than having all 3 pots the same height, mix them up a little bit. The same plants in those, but it'll give you automatically different heights. Good look.
We just talked about this a little bit, but with hanging baskets, what do you use for a liner? Because I know that is it cocoa or coconut?
Yeah,
that's something that you see in a
fiber.
lot.
It makes a really good liner because, of course, the older traditional was a plastic. Plastic hanging pot, and those are great. They're good. But also some of the larger ones are like a wire basket with these coconut fiber liners, and those work really well.
And I know that I picked up some at a store that are almost like a waxier, like a burlap almost, so that they do drain, but they also retain some.
Them.
Would burlap work?
Burlap would work too. Yeah, that would work too. A person can always, if you question whether that material might deteriorate a little bit, you can always put just a sheet of plastic on the inside. Tuck it down so you can't see the plastic, but then make sure you punch holes in the plastic so it can still drain.
All right. What do you if you're using a planter, something like for immediate impact, what should you look for? What are the things to consider? Because that's really one of the benefits of doing container gardens is that you don't necessarily always have to. You can buy a full size flame grass, purple fountain grass, something like that, and get that immediate impact, that immediate wow. What things should we be considering if we're going to go that route with an immediate impact?
Yeah. Now, when we had our garden center, we used to pot up custom planters, and we would always ask the people one of two questions. Okay. Do you want it to look full right now, or do you want to give it some room to grow? And I'll tell the advantages of each one. But oftentimes for graduations or anniversaries, we want them to look full right now. Because, the object of graduation open house is to make people think like you live that way all the time. Yeah. So in May, you want that planter to look full. There's a problem with that. I mean, it looks pretty. But if it immediately is full, there's no space for the plants to grow. And they're quickly going to probably go downhill because they'll be out competing themselves. They'll get too crowded. And by July, they're going to be going downhill already. So if you do want the immediate look, or if you're doing it for graduation or a celebration and want that full look, whether you're buying it from a garden center or doing it up yourself, by the middle of summer, just trim things. When they're looking like they're overcrowded, just take a shears and snip away at it to give them some space to grow, and that'll kind of give a new life. So, and I know we all like that immediate look, but you're going to have to maintain that by the middle of summer. Okay. The other way to do it is to give the plants space to grow. So when you're potting them up, you've bought your plants, you're potting them up, space them out so that they can each develop. It's not going to be immediate full look, but you're going to give them room to grow. So in the long run, they're going to do probably better all season. So it's interesting. Immediate, that instant gratification comes at a cost. The more traditional way is to space these plants in your container so that they're going to each have space to develop.
If you want that immediate impact, can you kind of disassemble that planter as far as like the plants in there and pull them out and to pull, let's say you pull out one plant and put it in its own planter later? Or do all the roots kind of grow together? Do they become kind of tangled?
Yeah, if given too much time, the roots would become entangled. But now that is an interesting concept. If a person needs it for graduation, have it full, and then maybe separate it out afterwards. That would be a good idea too.
And I suppose another thing to do too is if you have a planter with some depth in it, you could actually just keep it in the pot that you bought it in, put it in a larger planter, and then you could kind of pull it all out then after that.
You could really give the aura that it's a full thing by just leaving it in the pots and, put it in the larger container in their individual pots and then kind of cover the tops with potting mix so it looks like they were all potted up and in there. And then, of course, after the celebration, then pot them with the distance that they should have. Would this be a good time to talk about how many plants we should put in a container?
This is a perfect time to talk about that.
Yeah, let's do that.
So do you have kind of a ratio, don't you?
Yeah. Now, when we had the years we had the garden center, it was always fun to help people. Some people would bring in their pot, not for us to pot up, but just so we could help them decide how many plants should you put in a pot or a container. Or sometimes people would come in with a measurement. That's a good idea, too. When you go to a garden center, have the measurements of the pot or container that you want to fill. Measure it beforehand because sometimes we forget. And then the garden center can help you decide how many things to put in that pot. There are a couple of kind of rules of thumb on this size pot. Okay, for example, a minimum diameter container is probably going to be 10 to 12 inches. Really, if you did a pot or container any smaller than that, it's going to dry out so quickly. So really, a 1 foot container is in diameter is going to be about the minimum, and at most 3 plants. Now, if you're going to use something like the one of the supertunias or a plant that becomes quite massive, then only one in there. But if you want to do the thriller, filler, and spiller for a 12-inch pot, no more than 3 plants in those. Okay, so that's a 10 to 12 inch.
Okay.
Next, the next step up would be like a 14 to 16 inch diameter, 14 to 16 inch. Okay, you could maybe put 4 to 6 plants in those. Okay, then we get up to the bigger, up to about a 20 inch, and those 6 to 8 plants. So again, the temptation is to crowd these plants in, but remember that if a lot of these plants were planted in an in-ground flower bed, the customary spacing is to 10 to 12 inches apart in a flower garden, in an in-ground flower garden. So remember that when you're potting into a container, that when these things if they were planted in a flower bed, you give them a lot more space. So we don't want to overcrowd so that things start going downhill.
Yeah. One reason that people use planters, especially hanging baskets, is that they can give you some height. We talked about that you can put something up a little bit higher. You can use different size planters, but especially like hanging basket, it really draws your eye up, and that's kind of a nice aspect of that. But is there anything to consider with hanging baskets as far as, if you're hanging it up high, like we talked about a little bit, you don't want to necessarily have something that's going to be growing too tall in there, because then it'll be growing up against the roofs or something like that. I would also imagine watering a hanging basket that's taller than you might be an issue too, right?
Yeah, it is. And of course, for watering hanging baskets, I use the long-handled watering wand. Those work really, really well.
They're usually angled too.
Yeah, angled too, so that they kind of reach up and water into the hanging basket. Here's a tip for watering hanging baskets, which can easily dry out. Okay, when you first go to water a hanging basket, sometimes that soil can be dry. Maybe the hanging basket is even wilted a little bit and told you it needs watering. But that first watering helps to re-moisten the soil. So fill it up good, water it, and then go water something else, and then come back and give it another watering. Because oftentimes that second watering will be the one that will penetrate that soil, that potting mix, the best. And, of course, hanging baskets, probably the biggest enemy of a hanging basket is the wind.
Yeah.
Fuchsia, which are a beautiful hanging basket, but the wind just totally tears them apart. Luckily, some of the petunias are, fairly wind-friendly.
They can be pretty sturdy.
Yeah, and the ivy geraniums are fairly sturdy in our area. Or we can kind of try to put them in a spot that isn't quite as windswept.
Do you have go-tos? Do you have personal favorites or go-tos when it comes to containers that you usually use? And also, do you have combinations that you go to?
Yeah, of the plants themselves?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, I've got to have geraniums because we winter those. They're so fun to winter. And we'll talk about that probably towards the end of summer. But got to have geraniums because they're beautiful. And the petunias, the supertunia type things, those are just so many beautiful colors. So I've got to have those. It's interesting when you mention that because I don't want to let the growing season go by without some of these plants. So I always have those, geraniums. I love in a container the sweet potato vine, both the one that's kind of the light lime green. There's also a purple one. I love those. Those are great. Snowstorm with the white flowers. Those are super. And so those are a few of, the things that I just really enjoy in there. Oh, and another one that I really like for a sunny container are the portulaca. That's kind of the moss rose family. For anything that gets heat and dryness, that's a good spiller for in combination, something that likes it hot and dry. Oh, and then we have a porch that one side is shaded. And so coleus, I got to have coleus.
Coleus are great.
They are great. Just a pot of all coleus is amazing.
Well, and then the stems can be so sturdy that they can really, if you want some height, you can get some height off of coleus, but the stem, they will fill out too. I really like that. That's something I've really grown to love.
That's one of the ones that I really like just all by itself in a container.
And there's so much variety in them too.
Yeah, some of them will even tolerate some sun.
Yeah.
Or even all day sun. So you kind of look at the different types. But man, for a shaded area, coleus can really give some just awesome color. And begonias, I usually have begonias up on our porch as well. There's one type of begonia that I really like that we start ourselves from seed. The seed has to be started in early February, but it's called nonstop begonia. It's kind of a tuberous type begonia. And the flowers are large, almost like double roses. And wonderful. So yeah, I got to have nonstop begonias. So it's interesting you ask. There are some types of things like that I like to try new things each year, visit the garden centers and find some new fun things. But there are certain things that I've got to have because I'd miss them if I went that whole growing season without some of my comfortable old regulars.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for another episode of Growing Together, the gardening podcast. Don, if people have questions, how should they reach you?
Email is a wonderful way, and send some photos if there's questions. That always is great. And my email address is donald.kinsler. Let me spell the last name. Kinzler. Donald.kinsler@ndsu.edu.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. And this is John Lamb.
And Don Kinsler.
And we'll talk to you next week.
Have a good week.
Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.